Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to The Upside. I'm Jonathan Oleski with Jmore, and this is our virtual show brought to you by the Associated Jewish Federation of Baltimore and Jmore Magazine to keep Jewish Baltimore informed during this time of uncertainty. We have a wonderful guest today. Topic is very timely. I don't want to give it away, but if you have questions for our guests, be sure to type them into the Zoom chat or message us via Jmore's Facebook page. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce your hosts, Beth Goldsmith, Chair of the Associated Jewish Federation of Baltimore, and Scott Rifkin, publisher of Jmore. Beth and Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Jonathan. For many of us growing up, Manischewitz's Kosher for Passover wine was as much a part of the Seder tradition as matzo balls, gefilte fish, and brisket. Yet, not to take anything away from this sweet Concord grape variety, there are so many more options to choose from today. In Israel and around the world, winemakers are using an array of grapes and state-of-the-art techniques to produce excellent kosher wines. And with Passover beginning on Saturday, March 27th, what better time to add one of these new Kosher for Passover wines to our Seder tables? Scott?
Okay, so hi, Beth. Thank you. Hey, we've had lots of topics on this show, but never has there been one where I'm less confident to talk about the subject. So I really appreciate doing this. Maybe I'll learn something. My impression of kosher wines is they're the impression I've got my whole life was I drink a little bit of that Manischewitz wine and my face puckers up into a little raisin. And I never liked it very much. But Kenny, thank you. Kenneth Friedman is here, who's our wine columnist on Jmore and an expert on wine. And would you be kind enough to talk to us about the Manischewitz wine, but all the other options that are out there, and just sort of give us an overview and tell me why I don't like Manischewitz grape Concord wine, but help me on that one.
First of all, thanks for having me. Big fan of your show, big fan of Jmore, and certainly a big fan of the Associated. This is kind of a perfect storm for me to be here. I wouldn't say I'm an expert. Maybe I listened to Beth's intro, and maybe she should be sitting in my seat right now because that was great. For a long time, you see every year around Passover and the high holidays in the fall, there'll be an article in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal saying not your Zadie's wine, and I think we're so far past that nowadays. But the reality is that there is still that clear association with the sweet Concord grape. And there's a whole history to why that happened, which is very interesting. But for the scope of what we're doing, let's not even consider the Manischewitz wine. I hope that anyone that's listening to this today will understand that kosher wine has come such a long way from that. And really the birth of serious kosher winemaking goes back about 40 or 50 years.
So tell us the story. The history is always fun to hear.
Well, so in the United States, the first I hope I'm getting all this right. It's all up here. And of course the wine sometimes messes with that. And by the way, thanks for giving me the opportunity to open some wine at noon on a Tuesday. There's a winery in Napa Valley. It's an interesting thing that if you talk to most kosher winemakers, they very often don't use the word kosher. They're winemakers. And what we have to understand at the outset is that kosher wine is no different than any other wine. There's literally nothing different at all whatsoever in the process of the winemaking that differentiates it. So that's something that you should understand right off the bat. It is associated with the sickeningly, cloyingly sweet Manischewitzes of our youth, but that there's nothing about that's kosher, and there's nothing about a great Bordeaux that makes it non-kosher. Kosher wine just has to be made by hand. By the process of making kosher wine is just made by Sabbath observant Jews. So something I was going to get into later, but why don't we get into it now, is that some of the greatest wineries in the world, which are otherwise non-kosher wineries, make kosher runs. I'll show you one I have sitting here. I plumbed the depths of my cellar and pulled out some examples, but this is a famous label in the world. Léovy Poifferet, right? Very famous label, not known as a kosher wine. This is an 100% kosher bottle of wine. Why? Because someone great convinced them that it would be in their interests. They sell out all their wine. They don't need to do this, but I think they like the idea of making a wine available for everyone. So they make a separate kosher run of wine. So that's an interesting thing. So people should, at the start, just get away from the idea that there's anything whatsoever different about kosher wine versus non-kosher wine. And something I wanted to say just from the beginning is that, think about wine as it applies to Judaism. Really, almost all like Jewish ritual revolves around wine. We make Kiddush on it on Sabbath every week, Friday night, Saturday morning. We, under the chuppah at a wedding, at a brit, a circumcision, we give the child a little bit of wine. The Sabbath ends with Havdalah, with the separation service, where we do that over a glass of wine. There's something very unique in Judaism, specifically to wine, meaning there are great scotches in the world. There are, all kinds of interesting spirits, but there's something unique about wine as it applies to Judaism. And it goes back to the times. Listen, read through the Bible. It's all over the Bible. The story of Noah. He survives the flood. It doesn't end so well, and he was scolded certainly for it. But he came after the flood. The first thing he did was plant a vineyard. I mean, so it's all over the Bible. It's certainly part of our tradition. And an interesting thing about kind of the rebirth of the modern state of Israel is the explosion. It's kind of a marriage of technology, and Israel is known as a startup nation and technologically advanced, but they marry the technology with the tradition. And you can travel around Israel, and there are a lot of wineries that were founded in modern Israel over places where they archaeologically found old wine presses. So wine has been made in Israel. It's an original wine area, meaning you think, of course, of France and Italy, but the Middle East and what they now refer to as the Eastern Mediterranean, which is also included in Israel. And by the way, you should know that it's not just Israel in that area of the world that's producing wine. Lebanon produces wine, Syria produces wine. So that area is really a perfect area to make wine, and something that's been done for a long, long time. But any of us that know some of the history is specifically to the land of Israel, there were hundreds of years where a lot of the tradition of winemaking was lost. And particularly when the Arabs controlled that land, according to Islam, alcohol is prohibited. So a lot of that tradition was lost. But it's really amazing what's happening in Israel now.
I want to jump in for a minute, Scott, with some thanks, Kenny. I want to welcome to the show. Really great to have you. Talk a little bit about price point. People care about that. Are kosher wines more or less expensive? And what's the most, expensive kosher wine you know of?
Right. So really the entire scope of pricing, as it would be with non-kosher wine, exists. There are entry-level wines. I would say that kosher, like it does with food, carries somewhat of a premium, meaning anytime there's more hands in there, it's going to be more expensive. So there is somewhat of a premium, meaning that same bottle, that French Bordeaux I showed you before, it's a very expensive non-kosher bottle. It's even more expensive kosher because there are more people involved, which is one of the reasons, I think. But I won't get into that. But there are $5 bottles of wine. There are $200 bottles of wine. It's really all over the place. I try to find, I think as a lot of wine lovers, I mean, it's easy to open a $50 bottle of wine and it's going to be good. And you do that for special occasions. But Tuesday at noon doesn't ask for a $50 bottle of wine. So you want to look for things that are more affordable and still enjoyable. And I think that's why people look to me to, since I do drink a lot of wine and I taste a lot of wine, people want to, that's a question I get all the time. What's a good $15 bottle of wine? You have a burger on a weeknight. You don't want to necessarily open a Bordeaux. You want to open something really approachable and easy to drink. But the price-wise, they're really all over the place. I think the second question you asked me was about the most expensive. So that's an interesting question. A lot of the Bordeaux's that are released now, they carry big price tags, and $150, $200. There's some Italian wines now. There's an Italian Marsigliano that's I think going to be priced at $250. There's a wine coming out of Herzog in California they're using grapes from the famous Stag's Leap, which I think is going to be priced over $200. So if you want to spend money, that there are wines to buy. The interesting thing is in the non-kosher world, wine is really looked at as an investment for a lot of people. And that's still a developing market in the kosher world. Meaning if you're buying wine for investments, you're probably better off investing in other things. So that, that like finding an old 1950, whatever, that doesn't really exist so much, but I imagine 50 years from now, it will.
Yeah, I see every now and then in the newspaper that somebody bought some wine for some ridiculous amount of dollars and then decided to open it and found that what he had was vinegar.
Right. Right. Wine, one of the beautiful things about what I love about it is that it's so organic, and wine, each bottle of wine tells a story of something to step back a little bit, every time I meet a winemaker, and certainly when the first few winemakers I met, I guess when you're growing up, you think of wine as you think of some fancy French guy or something. And winemakers are farmers. I mean, that's at the root, they're farmers, and they're very much salt of the earth people. But, so I love that about it. And I love the idea that every bottle of wine is different. Every vintage is different. Every area in the world's different. You buy a bottle of Jack Daniels, and that's Jack Daniels goes for this. They try to make every single one exactly the same. There is a continuity in that brand. That's very different with wine, and you really never know what you're going to get. And I tell people all the time that, wine is an experience, and like you tie it to who you're with primarily. And if you're in a great place with great people and great food, that wine is going to be that much better. But you're right. I mean, you can open and you never know what you're going to get with wine. I mean, especially when it's old wine, there's a lot to how wine is stored, and it's yes, you're right that you will read that.
So many years. Go ahead, Beth. I'll tell the story.
I was going to say, and what about wine pairings? Often we know there's a certain type of wine for red meat or whatever. So if we're having brisket, is there one meat? And if we're serving chicken, or if we're vegan, would you recommend different varieties?
Right. So I'm no expert in wine pairing, and the reality is I go more for mood, I guess, than anything. I mean, there's definitely something to pairing wine and food. I mean, think about it. You get a great steak. You're not going to open a light white for that, or a rosé. That doesn't make sense, and they obviously don't go together. You want a big red for something like that, And as it applies to Passover, one of my favorite dishes of the Seder is, and it's really like you read through that Haggadah, and you're starving. And I know for me, I have teenage kids that spend months preparing for what they're going to say at the Seder, and in the back of my head, I say out loud, I hope they're not watching this. But, I love hearing what they're going to say. I'm kidding. But by the time you eat, it's late, you're starving. And one of the first things you get to eat is the gefilte fish and the matzah. And, as I'm a Baltimore boy, born and bred, I have it with my Tulkoff's hot white. And so I always, try to pair that. I always try to pair. And with something, like gefilte fish, you definitely want a white wine. So there you're going to go with something like Chablis style, like Chardonnay, depending on your taste. I personally am not a huge Chardonnay guy. I like acid in wine, so I love Sauvignon Blancs and, of course, Riesling. I mean, and I always tell anyone, Riesling is a surefire bet to go with anything. So really almost anything. So Riesling is an interesting wine if you want to talk about that. That's really just a wine topic, not a kosher wine topic, but we can skip that for now. But in terms of
I want to hear. Tell me why.
So
my wife loves Riesling.
Okay, so two things about Riesling. First of all, a lot of people think of Riesling and they think of sweet wine. There are bone dry Rieslings made in the world. The most famous area is Germany, and that there were actually kosher German dry Rieslings produced in the last decade, which to me is a pretty cool thing. But the interesting thing is that it's kind of well known that white wine is not for aging. You think of aging, you think of, again, Bordeaux. You think of wines that are built for the long haul. White wine is not generally wine. You buy white wine, you're typically going to drink it within a year or two of release. That's not the case with Riesling. And that's what makes it really such a unique grape, in that you can buy a lot of well-made dry Rieslings can age for years and develop all kinds of interesting different characteristics. I'll leave it at that. That's the short primer on Riesling.
Okay, so I hear people when they talk about wine tell me about all the undertone, tastes that they have in the wine, and they go on and on and on. And I drink it and I say, it tastes like wine.
It's like wine, right?
And I admit that I know almost nothing about wine.
Yeah, well, listen.
People being just showing off, or is it really there that you?
Of course. I listen. Sometimes I'm talking about wine. Right now, I'm like, I sound like such a jerk. I mean, you almost can't talk about wine and not sound like a jerk, right? You start using, these tasting notes. And something I read a long time ago is like, don't ever use a tasting note that you haven't tasted yourself. And I read sometimes like forest floor. Does anyone taste the forest floor? I don't know. What does that even mean necessarily? I guess the more and more you taste wine, you understand the ideas behind these things. But I myself, like, first of all, taste is totally subjective. We all know that. But the things I shoot for are more the larger characteristics of wine. The level of acid, the tannins, which you might want to ask, what are tannins? Tannins are that dry feeling you get when you drink wine. If there's that puckering, dry type of feeling on the top of your mouth or on the sides of your gums, that's where you're noticing the tannins. But those are the kind of things, because anyone really, that's a little bit familiar with wine can start to understand the difference between a lot of acid versus no acid, a lot of sweetness versus no sweetness, a lot of body versus no body. Those are the kind of things that if I'm doing a tasting note, I try to stick with. Now, when I write, for Jmore, I try to look fancy and I use bigger words on the wine wheel, but
we're impressed. We like Jmore.
Right. So it works. It works.
So give us a few recommendations. Okay, so folks are preparing for Passover. Throw out 3 or 4 different price range kind of recommendations.
Sure. I have a bunch of bottles sitting on my desk. This is something I have in my glass right now. Now, this is Gilgal. This is made by Golan Heights Winery, aptly named for where it's made in the Golan Heights. Gilgal is a very entry-level brand and priced in the tens. This bottle I think is $14. That's a Pinot Noir. That was actually something I was going to mention, because let's say you're at your Passover Seder, you're not the traditional brisket people, and you're going to instead have turkey. Pinot Noir to me is a perfect pairing with turkey. Why? Because it's not so heavy-bodied. It's not so over the top that it's not going to overpower your turkey. If you're going to eat something like brisket, then you want to bring out a bigger gun. I did bring out a bottle from my cellar that is a really special bottle. It's something I have a lot of them, and I specifically open one at the Seder every year. There's a whole interesting story. It's a pretty bottle. Clos Misora, made by LV Winery in Barcelona. Now, without getting into their entire history, the really interesting thing about that winery is that I believe it's the first all kosher winery in Spain since the Spanish Inquisition, which is an unbelievable thing. I heard the winemaker himself say that. Really unbelievable thing. But about the wine, I mean, it is a blend of Carignan, Syrah, I think, and Grenache, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of fruit, some spice, but a really, really well-made wine. That wine is a higher end. This is going to retail, about $65 to $75. But if you want to open a big gun, I look at it this way. There's a blessing you say at every holiday. And it's Shehecheyanu v'kiyamanu, and you say that you're thanking God for bringing you to this day. I take a second before you say it, right at the beginning of the Seder, when, it's an interesting thing, and it goes back to what I said at the beginning, that the Seder itself begins over a glass of wine, and then you read through the whole Haggadah. But whoever prepared that knew what they were doing. Let's say that. But one of the blessings you say that night is that blessing, and you're thanking God for bringing you in health to this day. And to me, you look around the table, and in the age of COVID, it's tough to really have a lot of guests. But it's a tradition of Passover is that you do have a lot of guests, and in fact, try to invite people that otherwise wouldn't have a place. It's something you should put in mind for the future. But I look around my table and you get that feeling like this is your inner circle. If you're not going to open a great bottle of wine, then what are you saving it for? It's the Passover Seder night. You have the best people in the world around you. That's what that bottle was created for. I think I got off the original question.
No, that's it. But it's such a great point. It's such a great point. I can remember years ago going, and I was actually buying a bottle of vodka, and I bought an inexpensive and an expensive. And I said the expensive one was for when I had guests, and the inexpensive one was for my daily. And the person in the store said to me, "Why would you treat your friends and family better than you treat yourself? You should also have the better, it was vodka for yourself." So I really think about that a lot and doing that. Is there a market for kosher wines outside of the kosher community? So, do other consumers have a desire for them?
That's a good question. So the whole idea of kosher really has kind of exploded. You look at organizations like the Orthodox Union, the OEU. There's a market. This may not even apply to wine itself, but there's a market for something that's kosher, far outside the reaches of the Jewish community. Meaning people look at it as a symbol of quality, or certainly as a symbol that there's oversight there, that we know that whatever's in there is known, that there's not someone in there in the back like mixing things in without or cheapening it some way. So it is a symbol of quality, and it also goes to that the kosher consumer is much more what's the word I'm looking for, is much more educated, I guess, than they were, and pickier than they were a couple generations ago. Part of that makes me feel bad a little bit because I know my grandparents weren't doing any of these things, and they weren't is the salmon 48-hour cure or 36-hour cure? Whatever they got, but we've come a long way, and there's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing wrong with taking these things seriously either. But does the non-kosher consumer look for kosher wine? I don't know about that specifically. Definitely kosher food, I think, is sought out, but it's the flip side, I think, in that a lot of, let's say it this way also, Israel is starting to be taken very seriously on the international stage, and not because of kosher wine, even though, of course, it's always kind of tied to kosher wine. It's because it's a great wine region, and it's because it's producing world-class wines, and it's starting to be recognized by famous, by Wine Spectator, Wine Decanter, these publications that judge wines across the world. Israeli wines are getting these scores, and not just Israeli wines, but kosher wines. They may mention that it's kosher, but that's not why they're winning awards. And I think a lot of producers sometimes shy away from the term kosher, like I said earlier, specifically because of the thing it puts in your head. So, they may happen to be kosher, but they don't necessarily advertise that.
Kenny, do you have a single favorite wine that you love? What's your
that really depends on on when you ask me, and a few months from now that may be different. I think like most people should, I'm always trying to educate myself on it. I'm always trying to expand my palate. I try to taste as many wines as I can. I love Riesling, dry Riesling, I should say. And right now I really, I guess I have a thing for bubblies. I've been drinking a lot of sparkling wine and champagne and Prosecco and everything that whole category I love. But the one I showed you is one of my favorites. I did bring up this is one of my favorite consistent year in, year out dry Rieslings. I don't know how well this shows on the screen, but this is made at the legendary and iconic Carmel Winery in Israel, which has been around since the 1800s. And that's a dry Riesling and ageable, like I had mentioned earlier. So that would probably be one of my favorite white wines. And that red wine I showed you from Spain, that LV winery, Clos Massaro, might be one of my favorite reds. But favorites and what I can afford are two different things. So
now, are these wines all available at the local liquor stores? Is there a liquor store that you really like that has a great selection?
I think all of the local stores have great offerings. Maryland is a tricky place as it applies, number one, to liquor laws. When I travel around the country, and you may be in a supermarket and like, wait, why is there wine in the supermarket? So it's difficult in Maryland. There are a bunch of local stores. I don't know if you want me to mention or who. No one paid me to mention. I want some kind of referral credits. Locally, there's Kosher Bite has a very nice selection. Accents has a selection nearby. The Quarry does a very nice job, and they've really, over the amount of time they've been open. When did the Quarry open? 10, 15 years ago, I would say. The Quarry shops, maybe 15 years ago, something like that. He's really expanded his offerings of kosher. He has a great selection there. I think locally you probably pay a little bit more. I mean, there's a convenience to that. And of course, I very much like to support brick and mortar places. But for the most part, over the years, I've bought a lot online. I buy a lot online. I buy from wineries themselves. Some of these more boutique wineries. There's a winery in California started by a couple rock star brothers called Shira Winery. It's been around for about 15 years, and they make really interesting wines, very cool labels. I meant to bring a bottle up to show one of the labels. And so that's a winery that it's going to be hard to find that. I think there's a place next to Trader Joe's, Wine Loft. I think he may be the only place to carry their wines. You have to know where to look. This wine that I showed early on, that Gilgal, is pretty much available anywhere. Any store that carries kosher wine should have that. But anyone can reach out to me. I think my address is in the Jmore column. Also, I'm on Instagram at Kosher Wine Tastings.
Kenny, so we have a question from Facebook, because we have most of our audience watches this, several thousand on Facebook. And great question from David, who wants to know, what do you drink for the 4 cups during your Sudorum?
That is a great question. And it depends among the people I speak to who I consider like experts. A lot of people so as it applies to real halakha, you have to drink a certain amount in a certain amount of time. So you, to some degree, gulp the wine. So there are a lot of people that would say, don't use your fanciest wines for that. You really want to sit and appreciate them. And it's 4 cups of wine. That's even for a veteran, that's a lot of wine. So there are a lot of wines being made now but it should be red wine, or at least have a red color. So some people drink rosé. That is one way to go. For me, I try to drink something. This Pinot Noir, I think, and I know I keep talking about it. It's something that's a little lighter. It's easier to drink. It's not super high in alcohol. That would be a good choice. But like I said, I do open a great wine on the night of Passover, because I just feel like it's a very special occasion. And what are those wines for, if not? But it's a great question, because there are different opinions on that. Some people would say just drink something easy to drink. Some people would drink something with a little sweetness. I really love the idea of opening at least one of my, heavy duty, something I've been hiding in my cellar for a long time on the night of Passover. I wouldn't say, especially when I have large crowds, I'm not necessarily passing them around the table. But
keep stuff down to the end of the table. That's
right,
good.
right. Exactly.
Our Seder
Well, of course, this year when we
What
can't have,
what are you guys drinking? Let me ask you that. I'll turn around the question.
it tends to be whatever we have. And we just grab a couple of bottles and get them out on the table. We're not all that picky with it. Although I have a younger brother who claims to be a real wine expert. It's scary sometimes. He once gave me a gift and then took it back about 10 years later when I hadn't drank it yet.
well,
He said I didn't deserve it.
but wait, speaking of halacha, I mean, so what about people, households, for instance, where do not ever use alcohol? Because one or more family members may have an issue, let's say, or whatever, for whatever reason, a non-alcoholic. So what can we use instead and still follow the rituals?
Well, grape juice. Grape juice fills all the requirements, and
Great.
I like to bring him up because I think about him all the time. But I lost my dad about a year ago, and like I grew up in a house where the same exact bottles I saw when I was 5 were there, 30 years later. My parents, not drinkers at all. My father made fun of everything I drank. And in fact, the only thing he liked was the Manischewitz, and what he liked, the Shapiros of it. He said Shapiros was his thing. That was the only thing he liked. He's like, that's the good stuff. So there are also very low alcohol wines. They're Moscato, bubblies, things of that nature, which have about 5% alcohol by volume, that are much easier and lighter to drink. Those are always options. But first of all, I don't claim to be a halachic expert in any way, shape, or form. I wear this mostly to cover the baldness. But grape juice would fulfill every single requirement.
Very good.
So holds a place at our table.
So Kenny, thank you for doing this. You've been a real expert, and the expert is defined as the person who knows more than you. So in this case, you know way more than I do, and probably Beth. And thank you for being our expert on this. Talk a little bit. You're kind enough to come on, but you have a career as a real professional in this community. Talk a little bit about what you do for a living and promote your practice a little bit, because it certainly deserves that, and we appreciate your help.
I'm not looking to promote anything. It's
I brought
it. One of the reasons I think that I've like started to earn some reputation is I think because people trust me. I do this out of love. I'm not selling anything ever. And one thing I do want to mention that I will plug, and somewhere I know Beth from, is the Associated and the Life and Legacy program, which if anyone wants to discuss that with me, I would love to discuss it. The Associated is doing great things in Baltimore, and I'm really so proud to be involved with them. I am by profession a chiropractor. I have been for 20 years. It's something I love doing. Clearly, I run a small practice, which allows me the time to do things like this and time to involve myself in the community. I am involved in a lot of different things. I have built up a lot of these wine tastings and whatever on my own, something I really love doing. I think every time I get involved in something, my wife might groan because she knows that I do the deep dive on everything. Like I've been roasting coffee beans for 20 years myself, and like there's no going back. But I do love my field. I love I guess I like talking to people. I think that's apparent because I haven't stopped talking in 30 minutes. But I appreciate you giving me that plug. But like I said, I do, in terms of the wine stuff, Instagram at Kosher Wine Tastings. That I'll plug.
Very. Say it again. Give it one more time. It's
on Instagram. You can find me at Kosher Wine Tastings, and I do a lot of reviews. My wife is the pretty face that's we bring on there. So to balance me out, and we have a great time. And I think I'm developing more of the ability to talk about wine with that also. But I do like to show and introduce a lot of new kosher wines in that realm.
Well, you've been great today. You've been a great guest, and truly appreciate you coming on. Beth, do you have a few final words that you want to go for?
Sure. Well, first of all, Kenny, thank you thank you so much. You know, Scott said it, you have been absolutely delightful, as well as, you know, having provided people with a lot of great information. So it's been a pleasure to have you, and keep up all the wonderful work you do. Thank you for the associated plug, and thank you for being a part of the system. And to everyone watching us today, Passover is only 3 weeks away. So as you are beginning to plan your Seder this year, which still won't look like probably your Seder from years past, please check out associated.org/Passover. We have recipes, craft ideas, Zoom conversation starters, and more. So lots of great stuff to be found there. Again, please join us next Tuesday for the Upside at noon. We'll have another great show. And in the meantime, continue to visit associated.org and jmoreliving.com for more information, stories, and resources, and to sign up for the weekly newsletter. And until we meet again, everyone, please stay well.
Thanks, everyone.